Hi, this is Privateer Station. Today we'll bring you another special. It aired back at the end of October of 22 on Michael Nacke's channel, and it was dedicated to the Battle of Kiev, how it was won. It is an hour-long documentary, and we thought that it absolutely deserves to be translated into English language. This one is brought to you by the voice and the effort of N. Enjoy.
It's been a long time since we posted an hour-long video. It's time to correct this big injustice. Today, I'll tell you probably one of the most important stories of recent time. It is the history of the battle for Kiev. There is a lot of speculation on this topic. The pro-Kremlin propaganda claimed that Russia never intended to capture Kiev, and what we saw at the beginning of the war was our delusion. That in reality, Putin had not even begun to implement his plan, and to occupy Kiev was never his goal. What did really happen? How was it possible to fend off the Russian attack? Why did the Western intelligence agencies make a mistake when they said that only 96 hours remained before the surrender of Kiev after the start of the invasion? How was it possible to defend the capital of Ukraine? What kind of battle was it? And how did it all turn out? That's our story today on the basis of the materials of the Washington Post, who were the first to begin to document this war as if for the history books, reconstructing step by step what occurred in the first days of the war. It will be a series of videos. Today, the battle for Kiev. Next video is about how the Russian intelligence caused the Russian army to start the war. And then there will be one more video later. It's not very important to me whether you will watch these videos or not. What is important is to put on record these historical events, to know later how everything really happened. And here's the first video from this series. You can support this video and this channel with your likes and comments. Let me know what you think about this idea. When you subscribe, this video will be recommended to a larger audience, and that matters. Well then, get comfortable, because this video will be long. Pour yourself some tea. I'm starting the story about the battle for Kiev. Kiev, Ukraine. A hail of shrapnel from kamikaze drones ripped through the tent where off-duty Ukrainian border guards were sleeping near a crossing with Belarus, 3 hours north of Ukraine's capital. Viktor Derevyanko walked to scalding pain, his body burning. Blood spilled from his hand as he tried to wipe his face. A piece of metal had traveled through his arm and stomach and into the muscle around his heart. I couldn't get my bearings, said Derevyanko, the deputy head of the unit. Only on the third explosion did I manage to fall out of bed and try to find at least some place to hide, because the explosions weren't ending. It was around 4:15 a.m., February 24th. Hours earlier, Derevyanko and the other Ukrainian guards had been joking dismissively about President Biden, yet again warning of a Russian invasion. Now they were his first target. Within minutes, Russian missiles began soaring out of their launchers. They pounded Ukrainian air defenses, radar batteries, ammunition depots, airfields and bases, filling the early morning with the sounds of war. At almost the same time, Ukrainian Interior Minister Denis Monastyrsky walked to the ringing on his cell phone. In recent days, he had experienced a rush of relief every time he opened his eyes into the morning light, realizing that the arrival of a new day meant Russia hadn't invaded. This time it was still dark. Ukraine's border guard chief was on the line and told him that his units were battling Russians across 3 of the country's northeastern regions. This wasn't a limited invasion, isolated to the country's east, that many of top Ukrainian officials had been expecting. Monastyrsky hung up and dialed President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. It has started, Monastyrsky told the Ukrainian leader. What exactly? Zelenskyy asked. Judging by the fact that there are attacks underway at different places all at once, this is it, he said, telling Zelenskyy that it looked like a full-scale invasion bearing down on Kiev. In the first minutes, they delivered terrible blows to our air defense, terrible blows to our troops in general. There were 20-meter craters, the likes of which no one has seen in their lifetimes, Monastyrsky later recalled. The question everyone faced at that moment, Monastyrsky said, was, how far can the enemy go with that enormous fist? If the Russians could seize the seat of power in Ukraine, or at least cause the government to flee in panic, the defense of the country would quickly unravel. Moscow could install a puppet government. That was the Kremlin's plan. Instead, what transpired in and around Kiev in the ensuing 36 days would represent the biggest foreign blunder in the 22-year rule of the Russian President, Vladimir Putin. His assault on the city instantly reordered the security architecture of Europe against Moscow and isolated his nation to a degree unseen since the Cold War. To the surprise of the world, the offensive against the Ukrainian capital would end in a humiliating retreat, which would expose deep systematic problems in the Russian military he had spent billions to rebuild. Despite the flaws that would emerge in Russia's war planning, the outcome of the battle for Kiev was far from predetermined. This account of how Ukrainian forces defended and saved their capital is based on interviews with more than 100 people, from Zelensky and his advisors to Ukrainian military commanders to volunteer militiamen, as well as senior US and European political and military officials. A reconstruction of events shows that even as Ukraine's political leadership had downplayed the likelihood of a full-scale invasion, the Ukrainian military had taken critical steps to withstand Russia's initial assault. Commanders had moved personnel and equipment off bases, despite in many cases their own doubts of what was to come. Ukrainian forces lacked sufficient weaponry, ammunition, and communications equipment, but what they did possess was a profound will to fight, one that would extend beyond Ukrainian soldiers to ordinary civilians, and most important, to the president himself. The defenders would also take advantage of terrain around the capital, dense forests, narrow roads, winding rivers that favored their guerrilla tactics, as well as weather short of freezing that towed the land and bogged down Russian vehicles. In particular, the Irpin River, a waterway that marked the line of defense on Kiev's western edge, would help protect the capital when Ukrainian forces released dammed water to flood its banks. Those fighting to save Kiev also benefited greatly from key miscalculations by the Kremlin, which set in motion a plan to invade Kiev based on poor assumptions about the mettle of the Ukrainian military, the durability of the Zelensky government, and the determination of the Ukrainian people to resist. In the end, the Russians wouldn't take any territory inside Kiev's city limits, instead remaining stuck for weeks on the capital's periphery before their retreat. As the war began, Putin was some 475 miles away in Moscow. Seated at a wooden desk in a black suit and maroon tie, he appeared on television to announce what he called a special operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Moscow had been left with no other opportunity to protect Russia, other than the one he will be forced to use today, Putin said. As the speech finished, booms resounded across Kiev. Ukraine's First Lady, Olena Zelenskaya, said she turned over in bed to find an empty space where her husband had been sleeping. She got up and walked over to find him putting on a charcoal gray suit and white shirt, no tie. "What is happening?" she asked. "It has started," Zelensky replied. He looked at the faces of his children, ages 17 and 9, before leaving for his office. Zelensky said he couldn't help thinking that Russian missiles were flying over my children, over all of our children, that an unthinkable number of Ukrainians were about to die. The choice Moscow had made, after months of pretend diplomacy, victim playing, and lies on the international stage, was beneath all dignity, Zelensky thought. He felt certain that Ukrainians shared his fury, that they would fight. Zelensky convened a meeting of his top advisors. They decided that part of the cabinet, including those responsible for police and defense, would stay in Kyiv, as others relocated to western Ukraine. Officials watched wide-eyed as border surveillance cameras captured hundreds of Russian tanks and other vehicles flowing into Ukrainian columns, reminiscent of a World War II advance, from Belarus in the north, from Russia in the east, from Crimea in the south. The whole map was red and required attention, Monastyrsky said. The Russians pressed into the hazardous zone around the defunct Chernobyl nuclear plant, where the head of the Ukrainian border guard, Vitaly Yavorsky, would later find evidence that they had dug trenches in radioactive soil and eaten contaminated deer they shot in the woods. The goal of the invaders was to penetrate and seize Kiev, the centuries-old metropolis topped with golden domes above the Dnieper River. Declared the mother of Russian cities by Oleg of Novgorod when he seized it in the Middle Ages, the city shares a past with Russia that Putin had seized upon to undermine Ukrainian sovereignty. Putin had characterized Russians and Ukrainians as one people, separated by Soviet history and Western interference, building a case for going to war to reset history. As morning broke over Kiev, Zelensky began to work the phones, speaking with President Biden, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and other leaders to ask for help. Within hours, he sat down at a desk and self-recorded a video to the Ukrainian people, millions of whom had considered an assault on Kyiv an impossibility and were now waking up to explosions and piling into their cars in shock. Today I ask you, each one of you, to remain calm. If it is possible, please stay home, Zelensky said. We are working. The army is working. The entire security and defense sector of Ukraine is working. He promised to appear later, in a day, and stay in regular contact, assuring Ukrainians that they would remain strong. We are ready for anything. We will defeat anyone, he said. Glory to Ukraine. Inside the government complex in central Kiev, the head of Zelensky's administration, Andriy Yermak, looked down at his ringing cell phone. It was the Kremlin. The former entertainment lawyer at first couldn't bring himself to pick up, he said. The phone rang once, then again. He answered. He heard the gravely voice of Dmitry Kozak, the Kremlin deputy chief of staff who was born in Ukraine but had long ago entered Putin's inner circle. Yermak swore at Kozak and hung up. Bookish and pensive, General Colonel Alexander Syrsky is the kind of seasoned military officer who plans for all contingencies, even the scenarios he deems highly unlikely. The notion that Kiev, where urban warfare would vex even the most sophisticated military, could be Putin's primary initial target defied belief for most of the Ukrainian elite, even within the armed forces. To think the leadership of Russia would unleash such brazen, large-scale aggression, honestly speaking, I could not ever imagine it, recalled Syrsky, who had fought Russia and its separatist proxies in eastern Ukraine and was tapped to lead Kiev's defense just before the invasion. It seemed to me that if active hostilities were to start, they would most likely start in the east, around or within the borders of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions. But we're the military, said Syrsky, one of several top Ukrainian military and political officials who spoke at length about the battle for Kiev, some for the first time. Therefore, regardless of what I believed or didn't believe, how it all seemed, I still carried out the activities required. Given the array of Putin's forces along Ukraine's borders, Syrsky had determined that if the Russians did attack Kiev, their columns would advance along 2 or 3 major highways on what they foresaw as a fast, decapitating drive to the government quarter in Kiev. The Kremlin battle plan assumed the city would be left defended by only weak Ukrainian forces, disoriented by the political chaos as Zelensky and his ministers fled. To protect the city, Syrsky had organized 2 rings of forces, one in the outer suburbs and one within the capital. He wanted the outer ring to be as far as possible from the inner ring, to protect the downtown area from shelling and keep the Russian fighting and the approaches to Kiev. Syrsky divided the city and the surrounding region into sectors and assigned generals to lead each area, creating a clear chain of command to which all Ukrainian military units and security services would answer. Tactical decisions would be made immediately by officers on the ground. About a week before the invasion, the Ukrainian military had moved all command posts into the field toward the probable axis of a Russian advance. Syrsky had also issued an order to move the army's aviation assets, including helicopters and jets, off major bases, putting them well away from obvious airstrike targets. When it came to tank power, however, only one mechanized brigade, the 72nd, was available to defend the capital, clearly insufficient for such a large city. As a fix, Syrsky said he ordered all the military centers to create special makeshift battalions and had the artillery system normally used for training brought to the capital area. Some of those systems came from the Divichki training center southeast of Kiev, where Ukraine years earlier had brought back into service heavy Soviet-era tanks known as 2S-7 Pions or Peonies. Juggernauts of artillery, each weighing 46 tons and carrying 203mm howitzers. They can fire shells of over 240 pounds, more than 20 miles. Syrsky ordered his artillerymen to take up defensive positions outside the city, to the northeast and northwest, the areas likely to face a Russian onslaught. That single move turned out to be critical, according to Kiev's mayor, former boxing champion Vitaly Klitschko, because Russia targeted the bases where those systems were normally housed in the very first hours of the war. The leadership of the country said there wouldn't be a war, but the military knew, Klitschko said. The Ukrainians largely kept their preparations to themselves. A senior U.S. defense official said Washington knew more about Russia's plan to invade than about Ukraine's plan for defense, fueling doubts about how Kyiv would fare. U.S. officials suspected that the Ukrainian military was wary of sharing war plans while its political leadership was downplaying the likelihood of war, the official said, speaking on the condition of anonymity to discuss a sensitive matter. Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov said he was one of the leaders who didn't believe an all-out assault was coming. European officials had been assuring him they didn't see the same threat the US and Britain did. According to Ukraine's own intelligence assessment, Russia also didn't have enough forces amassed over the border to capture or occupy a city the size of Kiev. On February 22nd, Reznikov had spoken over the phone with his counterpart in Belarus, Viktor Krenin, who promised that Russian forces on Belarusian territory would not invade, offering his word as an officer. And he was a liar, Reznikov added. 2 days later, after the invasion had begun, the two men spoke again. Reznikov heard a nervous and uncomfortable voice on the other end of the line. The Belarusian minister said he was conveying a message from his Russian counterpart, Sergei Shoigu. If Ukraine would sign an act of capitulation, the invasion would stop. Reznikov said he replied, "I am ready to accept the capitulation from the Russian side." The Russian helicopters swept low over the Dnieper. They flew south out of Belarus, then banked to the suburb of Hostomel, 22 miles northwest of Ukraine's government quarter. The Ka-52 Alligator attack helicopters in the group took the lead, opening fire on their target below, Antonov Airport, a cargo and testing facility with a major runway. Putin's chosen bridgehead for his assault on Kiev was the very airport CIA Director William Burns, during a January 12 visit to Kiev, had warned the Ukrainian that Russia would try to seize. Russian helicopters descended on Hostomel. Vitaly Rudenko, a commander at the National Guard base just outside the airport gates, looked up in disbelief. "Until the final moment, I didn't believe it. Maybe I didn't want to believe it," he said. In Kiev, Ukraine's military leadership had descended into a fortified shelter. Defense communications aides hurried down the hallway in pursuit of Lieutenant General Yevgen Moisyuk, the number 2 officer in Ukraine's armed forces, to ask him what message they should deliver to Ukrainians as Russian forces entered their towns. Moisyuk stopped walking and spun around. "Tell everyone, kill the occupiers. Kill the occupiers." There were early setbacks at Hostomel. Some of the air defenses the Ukrainians had set up around the airport were hit by strikes before Russia sent in troop carriers. An employee of the airfield whose son had been recruited by Russian intelligence had revealed their positions, Syrskyi said. The most combat-ready personnel on the base had deployed weeks earlier to Ukraine's eastern Lugansk region, along with their equipment, leaving the airport and base with about 300 soldiers, including draftees, who were serving out Ukraine's mandatory military service. Many had never seen combat. The helicopters were circling like a kettle of vultures over the airport, warring against an overcast sky already black with smoke from missile strikes. They opened fire at anything within reach, all the buildings, at any people they saw moving around, regardless of whether they were military or civilians. They didn't care. They were just firing wherever they detected movement, said the National Guard's platoon commander, whose radio signal is Malish, or Kid. Like others, he withheld his name for security reasons. As the first helicopters reached the airstrip, Sergei Falatyuk, a 25-year-old National Guardsman, propped an Igla surface-to-air system dating to the Soviet Union on his shoulder, peered through the sight, and fired a missile. It missed. Falatyuk reloaded, turned his sights on another Russian helicopter and fired again, according to Rudenko. The missile struck the helicopter. Falatyuk screamed in delight. The small victory electrified the Ukrainian forces, boosting the spirits of malicious draftees. It was actually possible to shoot them down. To do it, everyone thought, according to Malish. The fighters' morale increased. They grew more persistent. Regardless of whether they were conscripts, they were fighters. Several Ukrainian air defenses had been moved the day before the invasion, so they remained undisclosed to the Russians and spearheaded a counterattack within minutes, Syrskyi said. The Russian pilots struggled under the heavy fire of surface-to-air missiles and anti-craft artillery, particularly after a direct hit down to one of their leaders. They were shooting from all sides. In the first attack, we immediately lost the leader of our group. Captain Boldyrev, one of the Russian pilots, told the Russian state-run defense TV channel Zvezda. Boldyrev had to make an emergency landing after his helicopter suffered damage. Dozens of civilian employees across the airport ran for the bomb shelter under the cafeteria. Others hid wherever they could, including in the sewers. People looked at one another, understood what was happening, but didn't understand why, said Vyacheslav Denisenko, one of the Antonov employees. Outside, Russian forces streamed out of transport helicopters and fanned out to an adjoining small forest and a complex of buildings at the airport. The Ukrainian soldiers came under constant fire. Outnumbered on the grounds of the airport and facing elite Russian units with far more experience, National Guard fighters began to run low on ammunition. I gave the command to retreat, Rudenko said. The exit was chaotic. Rudenko ordered the air defense units and scouts to leave by hopping the fence. Guardsmen close enough to vehicles jumped in and sped away. Others ran on foot. Some of the guardsmen were taken prisoner by the Russians. But after the retreat, Ukrainian forces opened fire on the airport with heavy artillery they had deployed outside the airport perimeter, blasting the runway to prevent future landings. In addition, late on February 24, two Ukrainian Su-24 bombers swept over the airport and bombed the runway, causing more damage. Still, the Russians had their bridgehead. The Ukrainian equivalent of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Valery Zaluzhny, called Colonel Alexander Dovichenko, commander of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, the only such unit in the Kiev region and the main force defending the capital. "We have to retake Hostomel," Zaluzhny said. "Mr. Commander-in-Chief, with all due respect, I don't have enough forces to take Hostomel," Dovichenko recalled, responding. "We should try," Zaluzhny replied. Along with elite Ukrainian units, the 72nd Brigade's troops contested the airport for days, firing artillery barrages and blocking Russian forces struggling to move out of the facility. Moscow had been planning to bring in heavy equipment and more troops on cargo aircraft to aid the advance, according to Ukrainian officials, but couldn't immediately do so. That they were able to storm the airfield and take control of it in the course of a few hours, on the one hand, played a negative role for us, Syrsky said. But on the other hand, the artillery fire aimed at the runway delayed the landing significantly and frustrated the plan to recapture Kiev, because we know now that in principle the enemy allocated a maximum of up to 3 days for the capture of Kiev. Later, however, the Russians were able to bring in reinforcements to Hostomel via aircraft, Vdovichenko said. Over subsequent days, Russian forces already on the ground spread out into the neighboring suburbs of Bucha and Irpin and the town of Hostomel itself, as they sought to find a route into Kiev. But a week after the landing, they were still fighting in the streets of Hostomel. A 40-mile-long resupply convoy heading to Hostomel from Belarus ground to a halt north of Kiev, exposing Russia's logistical problems. One 31-year-old Hostomel resident, Masha Mas, had been taking cover in the bunker of a glass factory in the center of the town when she saw 3 Russian soldiers arriving on March 6 after Ukrainian forces had retreated. I said, "What should we do? If we close the doors from the inside, they could think someone is left in here and break it. Who knows? If we leave them open, they can shoot us. Take your pick." We decided not to close the doors. The first Russian soldier who walked in had blonde hair and dark eyes with giant pupils, she recalled. "Why are you looking at me like I'm a fascist?" Maas recalled him saying. "I'm not a fascist. It's your Ukrainian soldiers who are fascists." By March 7th, the Russians had occupied the bulk of Hostomel and were using the airport as a hub. Zaluzhny, the Ukrainian military staff officer, again spoke to the commander of the 72nd Brigade and ordered him to hold an agreed-upon line on Hostomel's outskirts and prevent the Russians from advancing any closer to the capital. "Not one step back," he said. The Ukrainians for days blocked the Russian troops from proceeding down the highway toward Kiev. Frustrated, the Russians tried to find another way into the city. Their best hope, breaking through a forest in the village of Moshchun, at the edge of the capital. Several hours into the invasion, deep beneath Kiev government quarter, Zelensky was breathing the stale air of a bunker that had been built in the Soviet era and hardly touched since. The head of the National Security and Defense Council, Alexei Danilov, had laid out the situation for the president. "The simple issue is that all of our partners are telling us it will be very hard for us, that we have almost zero chances to succeed. We will not receive much support in the first days because they will look at how we are able to defend the country," he continued. "Maybe they don't want a large amount of weapons to get into the hands of the Russians." Danilov also issued Zelensky a personal warning. There was credible information that the Russians had set in motion a plan to kill or capture him. At a minimum, Zelensky must ensure that anyone around him with a weapon was a known, loyal person. Whether he should evacuate was up to him. To make that decision, you have to look deep inside, Danilov told the president, without making a recommendation one way or the other. The stakes are too high. Others were urging Zelensky to leave. His presidential guard advised him to relocate to a secure location outside the capital, and possibly later to western Ukraine, according to Alexei Arestovich, a military advisor to the Ukrainian leader. Your office is a target, the presidential guard warned, according to Arestovich, who added his own recommendation that Zelensky should leave Kiev. There are going to be rockets hitting it, and saboteurs will attack. Even the bunker wasn't safe. There was talk of them barricading the exits and releasing gas, said Arestovich. Dark warnings had been emanating from Moscow for years, but this possibility seemed especially twisted. Russian units were approaching Kiev to liberate Ukraine from alleged Nazis by threatening the life of its first Jewish president, possibly, his advisors feared, with deadly gas. The Kremlin had reason to expect Zelensky might leave. 8 years earlier, Viktor Yanukovych, the Ukrainian president backed by Moscow, had escaped to Russia after a pro-Europe uprising in Kiev. The US-supported president of Afghanistan, Ashraf Ghani, had fled the country in 2021 as the Taliban surrounded Kabul. Russian leaders saw Zelensky, a 44-year-old former comedic actor, as a lightweight who would crumble in the face of tanks. As the day went on, Arestovich became convinced the Ukrainian military would not be able to defend the capital and told the president as much. People who understood military things went up to him and said, "We're not going to hold," Arestovich said. Zelensky eventually erupted. He was staying. "This is the last time I am going to hear this," Arestovich recalled him saying. "I don't want to hear it again." Zelensky told Danilov to stop annoying him with constant warnings about threats to his life, asking the National Security and Defense Council chief whether he had anything else to say, anything more important. "Listen, I'm a living person. I don't want to die, like any other person," Zelensky said. "But I definitely know that if I think about that, then I'm already dead." In the first hours and days, he lived with a constant sense of acute tension, his palms sweating like they would when he was a kid taking exams, he said. Reznikov, the defense minister, would eventually need to see a therapist, he said, because he was so emotionally and physically drained. Zelensky also received appeals about the need to maintain continuity of government from US and European officials, in some cases with offers to help him leave the capital. By ensuring his own security, the officials reasoned, he could prevent a power vacuum. He saw the situation in exactly opposite terms. If he fled, he would be ceding Ukraine's power center to the Russians without a fight, and it would result in the immediate collapse of the government. How would members of the Ukrainian military feel on the front lines if the president was gone? Zelensky said this wasn't about him clinging to the presidency. "I'm not trying to hold on to power," Zelensky explained to the Western officials. "If the question is that if I leave and it will stop the bloodshed, then I'm all for it. I will go right now. I didn't get into politics for that, and I will go whenever you say if it will stop the war." Zelensky suspected that some of his foreign interlocutors simply wanted the conflict to end as quickly as possible, with his administration effectively surrendering to Russia. "All of those who called me, there was no one who believed we would survive, not because they didn't believe in Ukraine, but because of this demonization of the leader of the Russian Federation, his power, his philosophy, the way he advertised the might of the Russian army. And so they thought, with all due respect to the Ukrainians, they won't bring it, they'll be finished off in 2 days, maybe 5, then it will all end." From the first hours, his chief focus became marshalling the support Ukraine would need to survive, from Ukrainians who needed to resist, but also from foreign leaders who needed to send Kyiv weapons and raise the cost for Russia. In one video call with European leaders, he said, "This may be the last time you see me alive. Ukrainian mothers are watching their children die in pursuit of European values," he told them. It left some of the European officials in tears. Zelensky's outreach proved to be equal parts inspiration and shaming. As much as he spoke to a given country's leaders, he also appealed to its people, sometimes by serving a blunt truce to their government in public. He urged German Chancellor Olaf Scholz to tear down this wall, a reference to President Ronald Reagan's call to remove the Berlin Wall, arguing that Russia once again was trying to divide Europe. He told German politicians they must do what they could so that you will not be ashamed of yourselves after this war. Yermak, the head of the presidential administration, said that over the subsequent weeks, he regularly texted photos of slain Ukrainian children and ruined Ukrainian homes to the cell phones of officials around the world, including Jake Sullivan, the White House National Security Advisor, Karen Donfried, the Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, and members of Congress. I confess, these were ghastly photos that were keeping me up at night, Yermak said. 90% of the people who received them, they reacted, they called back, and they started doing even more. Ukrainians of all ages who had never held a gun rushed to take up arms after their officials decided within days of the invasion to hand out weapons and arm a potential guerrilla resistance. Ukrainian military leaders bristled at the decision and later said it caused friendly fire incidents and interference with their forces' operations. Monastyrsky, the interior minister, called it an important deterrent to Russians, but also to potential Ukrainian turncoats. Any Ukrainian mayor thinking of betraying the nation would understand that 20 people with guns were waiting outside, Monastyrsky said, and that he and his family would be first. The visible determination of ordinary citizens underscored that Ukraine wouldn't be forcibly removed from Europe the way the Kremlin wanted, Zelensky said. For the Russian Federation, we were like an appendix that needed to be removed, but they didn't understand. They thought we were an appendix, but we turned out to be the heart of Europe, Zelensky said, and we made this heart beat. On the night of February 25th, as gunshots were heard in downtown Kiev and rumors that Chechen fighters were coming to kill him circulated, Zelensky emerged from his bunker and went out on the street in front of the presidential office to show on camera that he wasn't going anywhere. Standing behind him in the muted light of the street lamps were his prime minister, the head of his political party, his chief of staff, and another top advisor. The prime minister held up his phone to show the date and time. "We're all here," Zelensky said. "The leader of the faction is here. The head of the president's office is here. Ukrainian prime minister is here. Podolyak is here. The president is here. We're all here." We are defending the independence of our country. We will continue to do so. Glory to our defenders. Glory to Ukraine. Ringed by a pine forest, a river, and a lake, and with a pre-war population of just 1,500, the village of Moshchun was a picture of exurban life, a mixture of affluent professionals with weekend retreats and long-time locals in modest cottages. But when Captain Roman Kovalenko, a company commander in the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, entered the village with a small group of fighters on February 27, homes were on fire, villagers were running to escape, and an aircraft was falling from the sky. Within minutes, a platoon commander in one of the vehicles ahead of Kovalenko was shot in the face and killed. Russian scouts had just entered Moshchun. Days into the war, the village had few defenders except for a handful of Ukrainian militiamen, even though it was a strategic prize. Just beyond Moshchun lay the capital. The dense forest dotted with pillboxes from World War II and the waterway gave the Ukrainians a natural landscape to exploit. The urban river separated Hostomel from Moshchun, and the Russians struggled to move men and material across in the face of a hit-and-run attacks from small Ukrainian units. At the center of the fighting was Kovalenko, who just weeks earlier had followed in the footsteps of his identical twin, Dmytro, and became a company commander in the 72nd Brigade. For years, the 36-year-old twins had fought in the country's eastern Donbas region. Now they had ended up on the opposite edges of Kyiv, Roman in the northwest, Dmytro in the northeast. The shelling and fighting along the Irpin continued for days. On the morning of March 6, Russian troops finally began to force their ways across the river in numbers. Kovalenko and his soldiers counterattacked. "Keep firing, non-stop," Kovalenko ordered. But with his soldiers running low on ammunition, he ordered them to retreat to the village center. There, Kovalenko and his men regrouped with arriving Ukrainian special forces and other troops, some of them armed with US-supplied Javelin anti-tank missiles and foreign volunteers. Russians Grad rockets, artillery fire, mortar rounds, airstrikes, drone-directed attack, and helicopter strafing poured down on their trenches. Russian jamming cut off communications and made Ukrainian drones inoperable. Kovalenko lost contact with the rest of his company, left stationed in a village 6 miles to the north. The Ukrainians kept fighting, Kovalenko said, preventing the Russians from steamrolling through the area. You get so exhausted that by night you are just passing out, Kovalenko said. You don't care about the shelling anymore. Whatever is flying, you just need to sleep for an hour or two. You don't care if it's freezing, snowing, raining. If there is mud around you, you just lie down. Many couldn't cope mentally. It's hard not to break down. Sometimes I would break down myself. Kovalenko tried to reach the artillery units to ask them to open fire and stop the constant Russian shelling for at least a few minutes. At the time, the fighting all along the Kiev front had grown so intense that for a few days Ukrainian forces around the capital risked running out of 152mm artillery ammunition, according to top Ukrainian officials. The US had armed Ukraine with portable weapons such as Stingers and Javelins that could be used as an underground resistance, assuming that the Russians would overcome the Ukrainians quickly, according to a senior US defense official. Equipment and ammunition for artillery were limited, forcing the US and its allies to scramble to restock Kiev. On March 11, the Russians stormed Moshchun from all sides. On that day, I felt like I got hit with a hammer on my head at least 8 times, because everything was falling right next to us, Kovalenko said. A great number of our troops got concussions. Many got hit by debris. Everything they had, aviation, artillery, Grads, it was all firing at our trenches to get us out of there. The Ukrainians brought tanks and more experienced fighters into the village to rebuff the onslaught. Kovalenko was sent to the hospital for head trauma from the blast as his men rotated out. Tears fell down his face as he called his brother on the road to Kyiv. We held him back, he said. He couldn't believe he was alive. Then the Russians were facing fierce resistance from Ukrainian forces and militia units in the nearby city of Irpin and other areas west of the capital. Unable to break Ukraine's defenses there, the Russians decided to concentrate on pushing into Kiev through Moshchun. Looking at drone and thermal imaging footage, Syrskyi, the general in charge of the capital's defense, had seen rows of Russian equipment on the other side of the Irpin River, all lined up in battle formations. Moshchun was about to break. This was probably the most critical moment when I thought, well, is this really going to be it? Syrskyi recalled, because taking Moshchun means entry into Kiev. Part of the solution rested in an oddity of the Irpin, which flows to a dam 15 miles north of Moshchun and is then lifted up by pumps into a reservoir on the Dnieper River. The Soviets had constructed an elaborate system of sluices along the Irpin's 101-mile course to make the contiguous land arable. Early in the war, the Ukrainians blew up part of the dam to force a deluge from the reservoir down into the Irpin, running counter to its current as a barrier against the Russians. Special forces with Ukraine's military intelligence service sneaked behind enemy lines to rig other parts of the dam with explosives, said Kirill Budanov, the military intelligence chief. Syrskyi, relying on the intricate knowledge of a local agricultural businessman, whom officials had started referring to as the diver, said a targeted explosion at one of the sluices helped increase the level of the water even further around Moshchun. The explosion at the dam was just one example of how Ukrainians savaged their own infrastructure to create obstacles for the Russians, destroying roads, blowing up bridges, ruining rail tracks. Water flooded the Russians, and we later found a place where the Russian Marines had to throw off their body armor and swim to stay alive, Syrskyi said. But later, around the 3rd week of March, the Russians landed paratroops on the Ukrainian side of the river, according to Vdovichenko, the commander of the 72nd Brigade. He informed Zelenskyy that Ukrainian forces might need to retreat from the village because they no longer had the strength or means to hold it. We will look for strength and means, Zelenskyy replied. Vdovichenko changed tactics. He began rotating forces in for no longer than 3 days and brought in a new battalion. Because of the density of the shelling and the cold, it was impossible to stay longer, he said. His troops blocked Moshchun on 2 sides and began bombarding with heavy artillery fire the places where the Russians were crossing or concentrating. The Ukrainians pushed the Russians back across the river as Moscow's offensive began to crumble. In the hospital, Kovalenko fielded calls from the loved ones of his lost soldiers. 3 of his platoon commanders were gone. Many of the soldiers he had left in the town 6 miles north of Moshchun had been killed as well. The toll weighed on him. Some subordinates questioned his decisions. You did everything you could as you thought best, his twin brother Dmitry told him. If people didn't listen to you, that's another question. These were all completely new people. Everyone just mobilized. practically no one knew each other. After he was discharged from the hospital, Kovalenko returned to Moshchun to gather his company's dead from a trench where they had fought. Russian artillery continued to target the village, forcing the Ukrainians to take cover amid the corpses of their comrades. When the firing eased, Kovalenko and his men carried the bodies out on foot, one by one. February 24th, Lieutenant General Krivanoshko, head of Ukraine's Central Air Command, was in a hospital in Kiev with a bad COVID infection. As the first missiles began to hit his people at military airfields, he pulled out his IV tube and called the driver. He was needed at his base. The virus probably just disappears in these kinds of situations, he said. While in isolation, Krivanoshko had been working remotely and preparing for a possible Russian attack. Many Ukrainian fighter jets and air defenses had been relocated. As a result, when the first missiles hit, the Russians were often pounding empty spaces. Some jets were already in the air when the strikes happened, another tactic to save the fleet. We created fake targets for our enemies, recalled Chernihiv, the defense minister. Krivanoshko gave his units about 90 minutes to gather themselves after the shock of the first bombardment. In some cases, Russian missiles successfully hit the targets that morning. The barracks of the 138th Radio-Technical Brigade was destroyed, though the 50 people who had been sleeping inside miraculously survived. The younger pilots took rocket-propelled grenades and staked out positions to defend Vasilkiv Air Base, a runway that remained in use about an hour south of Kyiv. The older, more experienced pilots stepped forward to fly, knowing the missions were likely to be their last. I wouldn't call this tradition, but it was a rule that if there was a really dangerous bad mission, the older guys jump in the jets, said a Ukrainian fighter pilot who uses the call sign Moonfish. The older guys took responsibility, like, hey, I have grown kids. Krivanoshka said some pilots flew 3 to 4 sorties a day to engage Russian forces. They often skipped pre-flight checks and took off from shortened runways that had been bombed and then repaired overnight. That Ukraine was fighting back at all seemed to surprise the Russians and cause them to change patterns, Krivanoshka said, noting that after the initial waves, fewer Russian jets were flying into Ukraine, and Moscow instead began to use more of its limited supply of precision munitions. Ukrainian fighter jets, still flying days after the invasion, became symbols of a fierce resistance that was enduring, and played a pivotal role in blunting the Russian onslaught. Everybody, especially Russia, believed our air defense would last only a few days, said Lieutenant Colonel Smashny, chief specialist in the anti-aircraft missile troops training section, if not a few hours. On the ground, Ukrainian air defense units fired at Russian targets and immediately moved position, enabling them to survive for longer than many expected, even as they struggled against extensive Russian jamming. Colonel Periphery, the commander of the 138th Radio-Technical Brigade, said his forces are never supposed to be in range of Russian artillery, but sometimes operated within 10 miles of the front line. We would violate all doctrine, he said. Putting ourselves at risk, we were increasing our chances to destroy targets. Air defenses remained the top target for the Russians, and Periphery worried constantly about saboteurs revealing his location. Officials with the SBU, Ukraine's main internal security service, said Ukrainian collaborators marked some locations with paint that would be visible at night, a signal for where to direct airstrikes. In other cases, they would send coded messages containing coordinates to the Russian minders. A text with red flowers indicated a civil infrastructure object. Green flowers were for a military installation. The text messages were signed as being from babushka or grandmother, the officials said. The Russians had been told there wouldn't be any air defense systems, Periphery said, that enter the airspace impudently and we would destroy them. As his comrades were scrambling to stop the Russians west of Kiev, Colonel Leonid Hoda, commander of Ukraine's 1st Tank Brigade, was mobilizing to the northeast of the capital in Chernihiv. By the time the first Russian missile hit his base on the morning of February 24, Hoda had prepared for the worst. He had moved ammunition, fuel, and food to camouflaged, safe areas and dispersed his troops away from base into the field. He had discussed with his deputies how to slip away and form an underground resistance. He had prepared to say a final goodbye to his wife. Hours into the war, it looked like the worst was happening. Russian troops that would ultimately number close to 30,000 were flowing over the border from 3 directions toward the northern Ukrainian city of Chernihiv. Their plan, according to Ukrainian officials, was to rapidly take the city of 280,000 people and press southward along the eastern side of the Dnieper River into Kiev within 3 days. Along with the forces landing in Hostomel on spreading to the western side of the capital. They would form a pincer movement on Kiev. Standing between the Russians and the capital's eastern flank was Hoda and his brigade of about 2,000 troops. It is psychologically difficult to accept when you hear a column is coming with 10 tanks. Another column is coming with 30 armored vehicles. Behind them, another column of 12 vehicles is coming. There were these waves. Hoda left the base and sped north to Chernihiv to establish a forward command post. Waiting beside the highway north of the city, his companies ambushed and destroyed the first Russian column, firing at the formation with the artillery at such short range that the Russians had no time to react. A second Russian column fell in the same way. The attack stalled the advancing force and gave the Ukrainians critical time to erect defenses and gather their own troops. What ensued over the next 5 weeks was an underdog fight against the Russians that would play another critical role in preventing Moscow from succeeding in its lightning strike on the Ukrainian capital. The Ukrainians tried to force the mass of Russian troops into narrow stretches of terrain, dirt roads that were impassable, towing fields or swamps that would ensnare vehicles and force greater fuel consumption. Vehicles that stayed on asphalt were targeted by fast-moving Ukrainian troops. Bridges and crossings were mined and blocked. We would force them to take certain routes, where we would then blast them and cut them off, said Major General Nikolyuk, the top commander for the Ukrainian forces. This strategy drew admiring plaudits at the Pentagon. Coming down that avenue of approach was something like 30 battle groups. A single Ukrainian brigade stopped them. I don't know who that commander was, but he stopped them in their tracks, said Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs. They couldn't get off the road. Their junior officers didn't have any initiative, Milley said of the Russians. This guy was like a buzzsaw, just chewing them up. The old Soviet way of war, in which commanders give officers little leeway to make decisions and sought to overwhelm the enemy by sending lumbering masses of forces, remained the Russian signature, Nikolyuk said. We would kill 2 or 3 people, and then others would show up in their place. The first ones are still lying there, and these guys are advancing. It's simply 1941, where the lives of the personnel don't mean anything to the commanders. The problem also is that they are self-confident. They think that Ukraine is small. We will just override them, he continued. We'll roll through with tanks, and that will be that. On the Ukrainian side, commanders who had been leading troops in the country's east since 2014 had learned from Western partners about pushing decision-making power down the chain of command and ensuring that lower-level officers knew they had to act based on what was happening in the moment, without the crutch of the headquarters. Initiative, in any case, was forced on the officers. As had happened west of Kiev, the Russians completely jammed the Ukrainians' communications and satellite networks, leaving Hoda and others without a link to frontline soldiers. Ukrainian commanders moved around to their troops' positions to communicate and issue orders. Military communications were completely paralyzed, Hoda said, noting that his forces also drew on the local population. We had to work through informants. I'm not going to put all the cards on the table, but we knew with 95% accuracy even their smallest movements through other means. This was all locals. The Ukrainian will to fight against all odds was highlighted on a hill northeast of Chernihiv that had a commanding view of the city. Hold this ridge, Hoda ordered the fighters, because otherwise the Russians will have Chernihiv in the palm of their hand. For days, Ukrainian fighters defended or contested the hilltop despite savage Russian bombardment from tanks, multiple rocket launchers, and ultimately high explosive bombs that destroyed much of the ridge itself, Nikolyuk said. Nearly all the Ukrainians involved died and were found later in a makeshift grave, with a cross on top, Nikolyuk said, but they didn't surrender. You understand that people are prepared to defend what's theirs, and there is no way back, Nikolyuk said. When you see that, you understand that you already don't have the moral right to act in any other way. Many of those who died were part of Ukraine's territorial defense forces, volunteers who signed up by the thousands in the first days of the war. Though the majority were inexperienced fighters, they took on crucial and dangerous roles, providing critical extra manpower. After 6 months, Ukraine has lost some 9,000 troops in all and seen more than 7,000 troops go missing, according to official Ukrainian statements, though the numbers could be higher. Russia has lost more than 15,000 troops, according to comments in late July by the head of the CIA, who said it was difficult to ascertain an exact number. Hoda said Zelensky's decision to stay in Kiev spurred the troops. Imagine there's a war and you're told the president has run away somewhere. That's demoralizing. The Russian Air Force at first dominated the skies over Chernihiv. Only in mid-March would Hoda's brigade receive Mistral and Stinger portable anti-aircraft missiles from the United States and European allies, finally enabling them to shoot down Russian aircraft, he said. With brute force and sheer numbers, the Russians by then had managed to sweep across the south of Chernihiv and nearly encircle the city. Ukraine's 58th Motorized Infantry Brigade joined the fight, moving in below the city to help the 1st Tank Brigade. The fighting culminated in a village called Lukashivka. The Russians gathered an entire battalion tactical group of about 750 troops and piled ammunition between the white walls of an old Orthodox church, Hoda said. Russian armored vehicles flooded the village, some 7 tanks, 19 infantry fighting vehicles, and a dozen armored personnel carriers, in addition to trucks, he said. If the Ukrainians didn't push back at Lukashivka, they risked losing their last road of life in and out of Chernihiv. But the Russian decision to mass troops had been a mistake. Open fields and a patchwork of tiny streams separated Lukashivka from villages held by the Ukrainians, Hoda said, leaving the Russians exposed. Using small groups, we went out and destroyed 1 or 2 tanks, 1 infantry fighting vehicle, some personnel, and little by little started to cut off their logistics, Nikoliuk said. The artillery did the rest. Much of the Russian equipment was torched. At that moment, Hoda said, he knew the Russians would be defeated. They had lost too many people, tanks and fighting vehicles, and they no longer had sufficient forces to advance into the city of Chernihiv itself. Their logistics had been overstretched by counterattacks, time and distance. By then, the Russians had already reached Kiev's eastern edge another way. It was brazen and also foolish. By mid-March, with its forces struggling on either side of Kiev, Russia tried a new gambit, sending a line of tanks 225 miles westward across the center of Ukraine from the Russian border. As the bunched-up column approached the capital's city limits, the Ukrainians struck, ambushing the tanks with artillery fire. 19 vehicles were destroyed and about 48 retreated, a battalion commander in the 72nd Brigade later said. Drone footage released by the Ukrainians showed 20 Russian tanks scrambling to turn around in the mud by the highway. In an intercepted call released by the Ukrainians, a Russian soldier reported numerous losses, including the regiment's commander. The blow to the Russians came during a week of combat from Dmitro-Kovalenska battalion in the villages along Kiev's eastern edge. While fighting, Kovalenko remembered the words of his late grandfather, who had survived Joseph Stalin's man-made famine in Ukraine in the 1930s and served in the Soviet military during World War II. Never trust Russians or communists. They have brought a lot of suffering to my family, he said. Now I hate them. After the tank debacle, the Russians failed to regroup and never launched a major assault on the eastern edge of the capital. As the days went on, Ukrainian commanders monitoring Russian communications began to hear a change of tone among enemy soldiers. What had been enthusiasm had turned to panic and disappointment. Kyiv was holding and Russian woes were mounting. Russia cut its losses and announced in late March that its troops would refocus on eastern Ukraine. Within days, they began to retreat. They suddenly got together one day and left, said Kovalenko, who celebrated with his twin brother Roman. First of all, it was people standing up for one another and saying, no, we won't surrender. It was the power of their spirit. By saving Kiev, Ukraine protected its independence as a sovereign state, but Russia would go on to contest the boundaries of that state in a second, more demoralizing stage of the war in the country's south and east. On April 4, Zelensky traveled to Bucha, the Kiev suburb where Ukrainian officials would find 458 bodies. More than 400 bore the markings of gunfire, torture, or bludgeoning. Every day over the previous 6 weeks, Zelensky had been briefed on the numbers of dead and wounded. The families separated and scattered across the country and Europe. Though he had visited troops, stayed awake amid the sounds of nighttime airstrikes, and endured threats to his own life, he had mostly been confined to the presidential office. Soldiers sat on the floor throughout the many corridors. Snipers were posted near the windows. Zelensky had gotten used to all of it, he said, but nothing shook him as much as the visit to Bucha. That feeling that this is death, when there is silence and there is nothing left living, he recalled. Corpses lay on the street. Buildings were burned out. Officials showed him bodies of people who had been subjected to horrific abuse. This feeling is scary, he said. Everything is destroyed, and now what? This could be the way it is everywhere. This is how they work. Before Bucha, he said he had been so entangled in trying to secure more weapons, approving battlefield decisions, and negotiating with foreign leaders that he hadn't slowed down to fully ponder what had been lost in the victory of Kiev. That moment of consciousness comes of what is happening, what they have done, that irreversibility, that it isn't possible to go back. By June, Roman and Dmytro Kovalenko were in the country's east in the Donbass coal mining region, where Russia had unleashed an artillery war reminiscent of World War I, leaving outgunned Ukrainian soldiers pleading for more advanced Western weapons. Over a month and a half, more than two-thirds of Dmytro's company ended up wounded, missing or killed, most of the survivors left with traumatic brain injuries. Dmytro visited his brother's position and saw how Roman too was suffering, wearing earmuffs to soften the reverberations of the blasts. Within a few days, Roman was back in the hospital, where he stayed until deploying again in recent days. Earlier this month, Dmytro packed to go back to the Eastern Front after spending a few days outside Kyiv with his parents and his 10-year-old son. His son understands where he is going. Dmytro said he struggles with how to say goodbye. I say that everything is good, that I'll be back soon. Just wait. This is it. Big thanks to the authors for creating this article. It seemed to me this material needs to be communicated, including in a video format for those who do not like to read. This article is important enough, detailed enough. So next time, when someone tells you that Russia did not start the war, that Russia did not plan to capture Kyiv, etc., etc., no, do not show them this video. It's long. Simply now you know how it really happened, with details, emotions, and facts that were described in this video and the article. I am saying goodbye and encourage you to support this video format that is difficult and long. It's difficult for me to read. It's difficult perhaps for you to listen. This is why your like and comment would offer great support. Thank you. This was Michael Nacke.